In the same way that NFL fans have said, please stop talking about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, I feel like over the last week, and maybe it's just because Detroit's played Chicago twice, I'm getting a growing sense that folks are like, please stop talking about Connor Bedard for every little thing that he does. But I have to disagree. I have to say this is the NHL's best marketing opportunity in the United States that they've had in quite some time. What are your thoughts, Sean?
Yeah, I agree with you. Just like it's, this is not an NFL podcast, but I saw a good column the other day about how NFL fans should probably embrace the Taylor Swift bump in the NFL, right? Like that's something where for sports in general that have struggled to market themselves to women in general, like let's just be honest, that's something where some sports have been better than others, but in general, sports have struggled to market themselves to women. All of a sudden, you get a gift with the Taylor Swift thing that the NFL should definitely be leaning into. But this is a hockey podcast, so and we also, I promise, we're not going to talk about Taylor Swift, an NHL player. That's something that way too many people have talked about, and that's the last time we will. That's not something this podcast will talk about. But we will talk about Connor Bedard. And we were kind of talking before we came on the air here. Like, this is, you talk about an opportunity for the league. Like, here's the reality of the biggest, and this is just, I'm using Nielsen TV share ratings right now looking at this, since we're an analytically based show. Let's just talk about the pure numbers of it. The biggest television markets in the United States and North America: New York, LA, Chicago. Those are the three biggest TV markets in the in the world, actually. And New York and LA, sorry, but two biggest. But Chicago's the third biggest TV market in North America. This is, and it's not even hyperbolic. This is the biggest marketing opportunity the NHL has had as far as an individual player and growing the game in the national landscape since Gretzky played for LA and then the Rangers afterwards. This is the NHL has to go all in on this opportunity. I know it was funny to joke about, and like the Kyle from Chicago, where back at the draft in Nashville, were like, do you think it was rigged and everything like that? And the draft wasn't rigged, but the NHL got the best possible opportunity with where Bedard landed for its national relevance and national landscape. This is bigger than Crosby in Pittsburgh. This is bigger than Ovechkin in Washington. This is bigger than McDavid in Edmonton. This is bigger than Matthews in Toronto. This is a generational player. And I know people like, oh, stop saying generational. He hasn't played a game. He is a generational player. Like, I know it's easy to be like, he hasn't played a game yet. How can you say he's a top 50 player in the league? I mean, I've talked to scouting people, and they think he's going to be top 3 player in the world in 2 years. Like, he's already a top 50 player. Like, you watch the kid play. I watched him Sunday. I watched him last night. Like, he's going to be. You have to go all in on this as a league. You have to. I know it's going to be, if you're a hockey fan who is I've watched the game forever, everything like that. I guess maybe I understand where you're coming from, but you want your sport to be more popular. You want more people to watch. This is how you do it. And I think that's why it's happening. And I think you and I are on the same page on this.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you think about the match of a generational talent in a massive TV market, and then in particular in hockey being an original 6 market, in Chicago. We haven't really had that match in 30 years. Because you think about it, if you want to be very technical on generational talents, I mean, we're talking about Connor McDavid and Sidney Crosby are the two that have been, prior in the last 30 years. And now we're taking Connor Bedard and dropping him in a traditional, or original 6 market that's one of the massive TV markets in North America. This is what I think, and just like you said, is the league's, opportunity to leverage this, to expand its fan base, to go all in on this. And I mean, to be quite honest, a lot of teams have, I shouldn't say a lot of teams, a lot of fans have always kind of maligned the fact that the NHL doesn't market their superstars in the same light as the NBA, as the MLB, as the NFL. This is your chance. I don't know Connor Bedard from, I don't know his personality. I don't know if he's that kind of person you can take advantage of because he's got that outgoing kind of natural media forward personality. But if it is, then that's all the more reason you absolutely have to steer into this as a league. As much as it's going to annoy every fan of every other team, this is something you steer into, and then this is where you start to potentially build up those rivalries. With Fantilli and Columbus, being just right, stayed over. I mean, that's potentially one you can get, although unfortunately they're in two different conferences. But that's the kind of stuff you want to start drumming up as a league if you get these talents available to you. And so I just think you've got to steer all in on this.
And I think the other thing that people need to acknowledge, and it's okay, it's actually, if you don't like it, that's actually okay. Because it's good to have a hate watch. Like, it's good for, like, the NHL, it's good to have a hate watch, right? Like, for example, and once again, I go a lot to soccer because I'm a big Premier League guy. Like, I don't really care, like, Manchester City, you watch Manchester City because you want to see them lose. Like, even though, you'll watch Manchester City because you want to see the upset happen to them. It's good to have a hate watch. It's like, it's the whole reason why the Yankees are good. It's great for baseball. I hate the Yankees, but I'm more likely to watch a game where the Yankees have a potential of losing than the Diamondbacks are playing the Marlins, right? Like, I have no interest in caring about one of those teams losing, but I'm more interested in watching the Yankees lose. It's good for the NHL, for Bedard in general, to grow and market their superstars. But if you don't like it, it even goes further, because it goes further into the hate watch. You want to root against his success. You want to root against him. And that's not a bad thing. Like, so I'm giving the people who are a little upset and peeved about it, you're part of the solution too. Just you get a little bit, your vitriol could actually be used in a positive way here.
Yeah, I don't know if the NHL is going to want it to go this way, but I mean, you think about the NBA with LeBron James, right? You have a lot of folks that hate watch LeBron James. And that's due to, you've got the historical Michael Jordan fans, you've got, the folks that don't like his game, that don't like the way he carried himself with the decision going to Miami and stuff like that. You've got people that tune in just to watch LeBron James lose. And we'll kind of see if the same thing plays out with Connor Bedard. Now, what I do hope is that you're not tuning into this podcast as a hate watch here. Because folks, welcome back to Expected by Whom, a podcast exploring the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. We know a lot of you tuning in are Red Wings fans, and the Wing Wheel Podcast is the biggest and best Detroit Red Wings show out there. Find the show wherever you listen to or watch your podcast, and go to wingwheelpodcast.com for more. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit from Connor Bedard and talk about a story that you put out at the end of last week that got my interest up enough to, do a little further digging to see what was available in the NHL roster reports. And lo and behold, I found out I can actually get information on the utilization of 11 forwards and 7 defensemen versus a traditional hockey lineup of 12 forwards and 6 defensemen. So, Sean, why don't you kind of take us away in terms of why you wanted to write about it in the first place?
Yeah, it's something that popped for me initially because we're looking at Detroit, right? Being here, and you look at how this roster was constructed, and they basically went and built this roster with 7 NHL experienced defensemen. Even with Jeff Petrie having salary retained, they're all making at least 2.3, not counting Mo Seider, who obviously is not coming out of the lineup. Mo Seider's on his entry level, so he's kind of the outlier. But basically you have 6 NHL defensemen getting paid to be everyday regulars, then Mo Seider, who will get his big extension, and that will be another show at some point. And one of the interesting facets of all this is Shane Gostisbehere, right? Detroit brings in Shane Gostisbehere, kind of was aloof in the desert for a couple of years between and everything. And it was and Derek Lalonde brought up in our conversations earlier this week about he sees some definite merits for Detroit going to the 11-7 look at times this coming season. And it's something that with Lalonde's history, we saw Tampa do this quite a few times, particularly in that bubble season when they won the Cup in 2019-20. We saw, and you pulled the numbers to get a little bit more of the exact time Edmonton do it, but we saw Woodcroft has done this with Edmonton more than most teams. And I kind of went down the wormhole that you went even deeper down on, is what are the benefits of this when it's not injury related, right? Because we all know there's always 3 to 4 times a year a team will do it because you got a guy coming back from injury, you got a guy who you're not really sure on, maybe you got a young guy you're getting into the lineup, and so you go 11-7 because like, hey, we don't know if we're going to have 6 healthy defensemen, so we better have 7 just in case. So we know that happens. But there are advantages, I believe, and we can talk more about the numbers in a second here, of using 11-7 for certain teams, right? And as far it comes down to 2 things. One, it's creating specialists, particularly on your defense, where we'll use Detroit as an example, and as I wrote about this week, where it allows Shane Gostisbehere to be that offensive additional data point of offense for the Red Wings, particularly on the power play. I think you had the observation, I remember on Twitter watching game 1 about I think it was the first play, one of the first points Gostisbehere had, where the play in the 1-3-1 on the flank, where that's a play that Detroit missed last season. They didn't have that guy. It doesn't matter whether that guy's a defender or forward. They didn't have that guy on the flank to create the play that Gostisbehere did. And we saw Gostisbehere played that spot on the flank in Arizona, and he can play there. And that's something that will make Detroit better. Now, will Gostisbehere make Detroit better in 5-on-5 throughout the game? Maybe, maybe not. That's up to, we'll definitely learn that as that goes. But for now, that makes the power play better by having him as an option and allowing the defense to be kind of a full arsenal, right? Where you can all of a sudden, you can make a decision where you don't need a Ben Sherrod in the offensive zone all the time. You don't need a Justin Hall in the offensive zone or whatever, right? You can be smart in your deployment. And then from a forward perspective, and this is the way that Edmonton has used it quite a bit. And now the Red Wings, to be clear, do not have a Connor McDavid. Let's not pretend that they have a Connor McDavid. But, and this is something Lalonde brought up, was the ability to basically sneak your top 6 talent or top line talent in against better matchups, where you have, especially on the road, where you have to make the first change. You get a couple extra shifts for your top guys, maybe playing with your 4th liners or your bottom 6 guys, unless you get guys going on that way. I'll let you talk about the numbers because I don't want to keep monopolizing this conversation. But since you and I have texted, I've actually talked to a couple coaches, and so I have some other things to talk about the cons of this. But let's balance conversation and let you talk about some numbers on how you picked up on this wormhole after I started it.
Yeah, it's something that's always been fascinating because Jeff Blashill would roll out the 11-7 for stretches, and it was always one thing where I was like, man, this doesn't make a ton of sense for the Red Wings. And so from the NHL roster reports that are available, you can actually go through and get who is scheduled to play, who's going to be a healthy scratch, who is actually even going to start the game. You can get all of that information. And so if you simply just start with that and then tally up for each game, the number of forwards, the number of defensemen that are playing, you can get a crude estimate of, the structure that a team is going with. Now, this won't be able to capture scenarios where, as was pointed out to me yesterday, Colorado would take Curtis McDermott, a defenseman, but actually play him as forward. And so fundamentally, they're actually running 12 and 6. They're just using a defenseman as a forward. I can't account for that. You could maybe take another layer to it and look and see like who the line mates are for a particular player. But for our purposes, this was more than enough kind of crude estimate. And I started just by looking at the last 2 years, 2022, 2023, and then 2021, 2022. And first want to just take a look at league-wide utilization. And so, one of the interesting things is in 21-22, of all the lineups between regular season and playoff games, you had about 6.6% of lineups featured in a team going with 11 and 7. And that was actually increased in 22-23 up to 8.5%. But when you actually look at the splits by teams, it really seems that there's some teams that steer heavily into this, and there are some teams that sort of just dabble in it. So, for example, last year, Arizona led the league doing this 38 times. Edmonton did this 35 times, and then Colorado did this 30 times during the regular season. And those three teams actually accounted for more than half, or I should say, about half of all instances of 11 forward, 7 defenseman lineups. And so I found that kind of fascinating in how you've seen some teams really steer into it. And I think for the purposes of this conversation, it comes back down to how you perceive hockey, whether it's and I think this is going to feed right into your coaching, thoughts right here, but is hockey a strong link game or a weak link game? And for those that aren't familiar with the terms, strong link is the team with the best player is the one that's typically going to win. Weak link being the team without the worst player is the one that's typically going to win. Hockey has generally been thought of as a strong link sport, where the team with the best player is generally going to win. And in an 11 forward, 7 defenseman lineup, if you're Edmonton and you get to have more Connor McDavid, more Leon Draisaitl on the ice because you are now mixing them in on that fourth line, then potentially you are maximizing your ability to win a strong link game. Conversely, doesn't make sense for a team to do this if they don't have a Connor McDavid or a Leon Draisaitl, because then at that point you still have the worst player, but your best players aren't potentially better than the other team's better players, and maybe this doesn't give you the same advantage. So, there's a lot more to tease out of this from the numbers. This was just sort of an introductory look for me, but I'm curious kind of what different coaches think with respect to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was really interesting when you pulled the data on this, because there was basically, from my quick cursory glance from what you pulled, there's basically two teams that you're like, okay, hey, you should be doing it more. It's Edmonton, obviously, with McDavid, and then New Jersey, right? New Jersey is the other one that was getting the most value out of going 11-7. Now, smaller sample size, I think it was 8 or 9 games, but still New Jersey, where other teams like for example, like the one that was really interesting to me was you looked at, you had Montreal and St. Louis. When they do this, it gets worse. And that actually connects well, because I had someone who brought up a theory to me on Montreal for this. One of the things, to be able to run 11-7, you have to have a great command of your bench. It is something where, from as far as bench management goes, there aren't a lot of coaches who can actually handle it properly in a game. And some coaches know that. As much as I know I have some people who follow me from when I've worked in Dallas, there are some people who didn't like Rick Bonus's decisions and how he handled things. But one of the things that Rick Bonus was always honest with me about was, and when we talked about it, he didn't like 11-7 because he talked about how it was easy to lose players. And Dallas hardly ever did 11-7. And the honesty to not go 11-7 because you can lose players, that's a real thing. You can easily get into the trap of that, either that seventh defenseman, hey, I just roll these 3 pairs and that's it, and then all of a sudden that seventh guy is just there, and all of a sudden you just roll 3 lines, and all of a sudden you've just kind of cut yourself off at the legs. The bench management of this system is not easy. It requires it's much more. It's not, hey, to use Detroit example, it's not just Derek Lalonde saying, hey, Larkin line, go. Cop line, go. It's becomes much more of a full managing and keeping a control of the game. And yes, you have people tracking ice time up top and everything, but in the moment being able to better manage it. So somebody brought up, and this is not a shot at Marty St. Louis, but somebody brought up one of the interesting things they were curious about with Montreal, and I would love to look at this, was, is this one of the situations with Montreal doing it where we're still seeing Marty St. Louis' bench management is still kind of, he's coached 60 NHL games, like whatever the number is. He hasn't coached many NHL games, and somebody, in many games in general, somebody brought that up as a theory to me that I'm curious. I don't know the answer on. It's just a theory someone in the NHL coaching community brought up to me was, is Montreal's struggles with this more of a reflection of St. Louis' bench management? Because it's one thing to think of it as an application, it's another thing to actually manage that. And while John Cooper has won multiple Stanley Cups, when John Cooper does it, it's something that he has experience doing. Woodcroft, obviously, I've heard rave reviews of Woodcroft's bench management. This is really a big reflection of the bench management on all of this. It's also interesting too with the space where sometimes another coach who coaches in the AHL brought up to me. And this, it should be noted, this AHL coach said he would never do this in the AHL because you don't have players that good. In the AHL, he's like, you're always going to go 12-6. It's a development league. The only way you go 11-7 is injury reasons. He's like, in below the NHL, you would never do this. But he did say, as far as looking at the NHL perspective, it's something where it allows it gives a lot of space for the coach to overthink themselves at times. It gives a lot of space for you to make mistakes and coach yourself out of a game. So there's this human element, right? Like it's easy. It's very easy. It's almost black and white decision. Connor McDavid plays more. That's easy. It's once you start going further beyond that, and I think it's one of those situations where kind of what your data shows us in polling this is maybe we need to be giving Lindy Ruff some more credit for using it when it was only 9 games, but for 1 in every 8 games they're doing this, they're maximizing value the right way. This is almost to me more and more of a reflection of not just what players you have, but how good your coaches are at doing this. And I think that's the interesting thing when we talk about this with Detroit is when Detroit actually does this in a game, because Lalonde talked about it a lot, I'm really interested to see how Lalonde handles the forwards, how Bob Bugner handles the defense, because we'll learn a lot about the coaches, because they'll be the ones that determine whether this actually works or not from the management of the whole system.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that's the next step to analyzing this is you then start to take each of these individual teams and look at, well, what did the minute allocation look like for players within these games compared to the 12 forward and 6 defense games? Because then at that point, if you're starting to see what you were talking about and that a player gets lost, you go 11 forwards, 7 defensemen, but you've got 2 forwards playing less than 5 minutes and your 7th defenseman's playing 6 minutes. You probably haven't maximized the benefit of 11 forwards and 7 defensemen because you've kind of lost them on the bench there. So I think that's probably the next layer to analyzing this. And there's really this is an untapped area. I tried to find prior work that was done from an analytical perspective on 11 forwards, 7 defensemen versus 12 forwards, 6 defensemen, and whether it was due to kind of it not being a very prevalent strategy or otherwise. There's not a lot of work out there. So folks, if you're looking for kind of stuff to analyze and kind of think through and consider, this is definitely a hot area to think about when you're considering that nearly 9% of games last year featured this. And if you get up to 10% this year, I'll be very interested to see, if more and more starts to come out about why teams are choosing to do this. But it's certainly an interesting concept, and there may be other reasons that are buried in here that we haven't talked about. Is there an element of load management on defense? Instead of playing Cale Makar 27 minutes. Can I get him down to 23 minutes if I have a seventh defenseman in there that I can rotate? And that way I can save him a few minutes, of ice time there. Is it, some other capacity? So, I really think there's a lot of opportunities to dive into this, both from an analytical perspective and just from a human element. And so I'm very curious to see what you come away with, Sean.
Yeah, I'm interested to kind of watch this more this season. And like we like to use the line on this show, or not coined the line, but you use this line as, it's always stuck with me since you've said it on the show the first time, is the numbers don't say anything, right? The numbers give you a starting block, right? So the teams that I'm interested when I look at this, right? Like the 7 teams that did this this double-digit times last year. Edmonton, we know they're going to do it again this year. Arizona, same coach back this year, but who knows with where the rebuild is on that. They also had, for example, they had Gostisbehere last year. Gostisbehere was a perfect example of how Detroit may use him on the power play this year in that kind of specialist role. Colorado is that weird outlier where I probably will watch the Avalanche more to see how they do that. Is it a mislabeled player almost? Is it actually 11-7 or is it a mislabeled player? Because we've seen that before. Like I remember when I was on the Stars beat, there was 2 or 3 times the Stars, because of injury, went 11-7 and played, and they played Jamie Alexiak on the wing. It didn't really work. Jamie Alexiak was not good on the wing, but it was more so. Alexiak still was kind of in that scratch or not area of Dallas, so he was big. He can go to the net. Yada yada. It wasn't really 11-7. It was just, we're a team that's close to the cap. This is what's happening. Toronto, we know Sheldon Keefe is a fan of this system. He's talked about it. Now they only did it 15 times last year, but because it's Toronto, if you Google 11-7 in players, you're going to feel like they did it 82 times because there's 1,000 stories. There's 1,000 stories about every Leafs practice, but we know Toronto will do that. And knowing, for example, like Toronto has John Klingberg this year, right? Like John Klingberg needs to be protected in the defensive zone. And I say that as someone who actually knows John Klingberg pretty well. And I apologize if John listens and gets angry at me, but like John Klingberg is not a good defender anymore. John Klingberg is a great power play specialist and everything like that, but he needs to be protected in the defensive zone. And Sheldon Keefe having this history of like, what's better, having 11, especially with like, I'm going to rip on Toronto's lineup here. So for our Detroit fans, I'm sure they'll love this, but like, do you want Ryan Reeves playing fourth line minutes, or do you want the power play specialists in 11-7 that you protect? That's kind of the decision that Toronto starts to weigh on this. And then the other one that will be interesting is just Philly, because obviously there's a coaching change there. They did 15 times coaching change, and then also we mentioned Montreal, but just I want to watch those games now. Like I'm going to watch Montreal games closer when they do this, just to see, is this something where it will be hard for us to tell on television, but at least give us an opening. Is this a bench management thing? Is it a usage of or is it just a bad hockey team? Like that's the other question with all of this. But I think you kind of like, one of the things I love about this show that we've talked about is you and I kind of have intentionally gone out of our way where there's things we want to read about or talk about, so we intentionally bring them up on here so somebody else will also do work on it. Like, I'd love to read somebody else. I would love to go read 10, 11, 7 stories tomorrow. I'd love to read someone in Anaheim go ask about it at practice tomorrow. Someone in Arizona go ask about it. Like, I'd love to read about it. Like, one of the things I love about this show is you and I get to go down our own wormholes and hopefully try to rope more people in, because this is a space that I'm fascinated to watch now a little bit more, because it started as just how are you going to use Shane Gostisbehere, and then goes further and further.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's kind of been my MO for the last several years, because I tire of writing, and you find myself, I don't have a ton of time. So if I can tear down the barrier of how do I even start to analyze this by just being like, hey, psst, I've got a bunch of data here. You want it? It's like I'm the guy that's handing out the candy. Hey, you want some candy? Like, here we go. Like, here's some data, here's some free data, go figure this out, go write this. And so then I'll just nudge writers that are really good at doing these kinds of stories and be like, here's some data, go do it. And ultimately we get to read what we want to read. And the same way, if you find that you like our show and you'd like to support our show, please subscribe to the Wing Wheel Podcast on Patreon. It's patreon.com/Wingwheel Podcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits, like Wing Wheel Podcast exclusive Discord, which has a dedicated Expected by Whom channel, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're a part of the Wing Wheel Podcast Content Network. All right, so we're going to shift out of 11 and 7, and we're going to shift back to the junior leagues here. So, previously we've had a coach on from the USHL, Ryan Ward. Now it's time for us to give some love to the Canadian Hockey League. And so we have a very special interview today with the Assistant General Manager of the Kitchener Rangers, Mike Zsolt, who will be joining us to talk a little bit about his responsibilities in Kitchener, what he's been able to accomplish with that organization, the importance of kind of communicating with players at that level. And then ultimately, we'll even get his take on some junior leagues that appear to be rising quickest outside of the OHL. And so, without further ado, let's go right into that interview. All right, folks, as promised, we are back with another exciting interview. Today, we've got Mike Zsolt, the Assistant General Manager for the Kitchener Rangers, on with us today. Mike, appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Good to see you guys. Thanks for having me on.
So let's jump right into it. Can you talk a little bit about your background, your professional career that sort of led you to where you are with Kitchener today?
For sure. So I played hockey growing up, never at a high level. I played in the GTHL, but never junior. And I actually played rugby at a higher level than I ever played hockey. I played rugby when I was at Western University. But professionally, I graduated around 2012. And worked 5 years full time in the business world. So I did 2 industries there. One's management consulting, and the other's called private equity investing. And both of those were extremely valuable learning experiences for me. And I gained a lot of good experience that I've translated to my current role. And in the second, when I was working in private equity. For the teacher's pension plan, I started my own blog called Original 6 Analytics, which is still up online. It's kind of out of date, both the type of work and the content, but for now it's still up. And that kind of was my first exploration in hockey analytics. And really I was at that time applying things I had done professionally to sports. I really enjoyed it, went well, and that helped me make some connections and get some consulting opportunities. So the most notable there was the 2016-17 season with the Sioux Greyhounds. That was early on with Kyle Raftis as the GM. And then after 1 year there, as a consultant, then I got an opportunity with Kitchener originally as the Director of Analytics in 2017.
Yeah, I just, as you said, it's still up. So as we're here, I pulled up Original 6 Analytics, and I see some of the headlines of "Does every team need a Troy Terry?" and looking at whether Steven Stamkos left millions on the table. So I'll do some back reading today on that later today as well for some entertainment and some knowledge, I'm sure. You kind of as you kind of come into your role as you join Kitchener as a Director of Analytics, was it a role that existed? Was it a role that you kind of originated as you kind of came into the organization? Where was it kind of in the growth of, obviously every team has one now, but when you took over, where was it?
So in Kitchener's context, originally that seat was filled by Will Sibley. He was doing a combination of the video coach and I think he integrated a lot of stats and analysis into his role as well. And then he got a great opportunity at the time with the Toronto Marlies, and then I think he's now with the Leafs. So when he moved on, I connected with Mike McKenzie, and Mike decided to split the role of video coach as a different person and just create an purely analytics focused role at that time. So that was kind of how the process unfolded.
So now you've worked your way up to AGM in Kitchener. Can you talk a little bit about what your day-to-day responsibilities are as the AGM of an OHL team?
For sure, and it's changed a lot since I first started. But I think one thing I should clarify on the last question is I was very part-time to start. It's kind of changed over the years, but it wasn't like I still had a half-time, like 50% time job when I first joined the team. And that's kind of steadily decreased over the years. But so in terms of day to day, I continue to lead and oversee all our analytics work. But that's just one portion of my role now. I have a full workload as a scout. So both in person and video, probably, reaching close to 200 games a year. I'm involved in the recruiting process, player development, really just working closely with Mike McKenzie in all aspects of the management side of the team. Every year is a bit different. This past summer, we had tons of interviewing. So bringing in new staff, and probably a little more common in junior. That's, people go and get great opportunities and need to replace them. I'd say also working closely with our coaching staff and scouts, and also logistical aspects of the team. So, in junior, all the players live with billet families who host them in the community. So it's wear a lot of different hats now.
I have a follow-up too on when you talk about, and it's kind of extent. One of the things that I've always just stuck with me in my brain about GMs in every sport was when I was covering Dallas for a while. Jim Nill would always use the line that it's general manager because it covers all of the things you don't realize. It's one thing to jump on to try to build a roster and everything like that. But he talked about sign of people don't realize how much GMs and AGMs have to handle all of that other stuff. And you kind of just touched on something that I just wanted to go a little bit deeper on real quick. When you talk about you're getting guys between 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, and you're working with billet families and everything like that. When you and the GM and everything like that, when you're working with people at that stage of life, what type of experiences have you kind of learned about helping the human side of this? Because we're a very analytical driven show, but we try to keep the human element in it as well.
No, it's a great question. I think I'd say that element is there's a million different examples of it, right? Big positives, big negatives. How much a player changes, or if you just think about yourself from the age of 15 to 20, I changed a lot over those years. So it's, and I think it's something, speaking for myself, I definitely enjoy, and I think it's true for a lot of our staff, is playing a big role in players' lives, not just in hockey, but for them as people. Like part of our mission in Kitchener is to develop players on and off the ice. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's also true, and important. So it's great when you see someone put in a ton of hard work and achieve what they're trying to get, and how rewarding that is for them. And then it's also, trying to work through things with players when they are struggling or going through something challenging as well.
I think that point that you bring up about, all of the off-ice challenges that exist for these players, during these formative years, really the age 15 to 20 years is critical, and it's probably something that's not talked about nearly enough when we evaluate kind of on-ice performance, is giving those off-ice considerations enough kind of credit and credence when making these evaluations. And so, one thing I wanted to ask you is, when you have these 15 to 20-year-olds where you're working to shape them in terms of who they are on the ice and off the ice, how are you communicating? Like, what's the methods of communication that you're using with these players to sort of allow them to best process it or kind of put them in positions to be successful?
So the majority of the day-to-day communication with players, that'll all be through the coaches. So it's, they see them every single day doing on ice in practice, doing video, working on skills on the bus, on the road. Everyone's kind of on top of each other all the time. On analytics side, I guess, when we share information with players, there's a few principles we try to follow. It's possible to share too much info, so we really try to distill it down and focus just to one primary message and not share 10 different things at a time. And I think coaches try to do that as well in terms of video sessions and things like that. And also on the analytics side, we try to work really closely with the coaching staff to be closely integrated with them. And, if we were to show stats to a player, we always make sure that it's the right time and that we know the right messages the coaches are trying to get to share at that moment. And because you just 3, 4, 5 games, a player can go from having a great stretch to a bad stretch and back. So the more closely integrated we are with the messaging coming from the coaches, the better.
Kind of in your experience, I'm curious because you've talked to NHL players about it, you talk to guys who have been in the league, and you talk to players about analytics, and there's a varying level of understanding or where it became part of their career. You're dealing with a demographic of players who, for pretty much their entire, once they've come to, anyone on your roster right now has been in the age where analytics have already been part of hockey. And I'm curious, as you've talked with players, and is there a understanding, interest, want from players now more in this generation of players to use those tools, or they seek it out, or is it still more management and coach driven?
I think once they know it's there, like that, once we show them some of the info that we have, they definitely do seek it out. To your point, this current generation, they're very comfortable with charts, visualizations, visual representations of data. And so when you show them something, they get it pretty fast. It's, I think, in contrast to the more subjective elements of the game, it doesn't usually seem personal. It can, you want to highlight good things or bad things at the right time, but it's not me personally saying they need to work on something. It's we counted it up, right? Or there's ways to measure it. So and it's not always black and white because how you present things can change things, but it feels black and white, I think. So pretty often, or it's quite common that if we show a player some of their stats or trends, within 5 or 10 games, they'll come back asking, they want to see what's happened since that meeting.
It's fascinating that you bring up kind of how players have grown up with seeing this data and seeing the information that makes them maybe a little bit more willing to accept information in an objective fashion and not take it necessarily subjectively or personally. You've now been kind of involved in the OHL space for coming up on 7 years. How have you seen the quality of data available to OHL teams change kind of over that time span?
It's been a massive change. In 2017, and publicly available OHL data, whether 2017 or today, it's still not amazing. The biggest example is ice times. Most leagues provide that. We still don't. And that's, on the team perspective, we have access to that now, so it doesn't impact as much, but I think from the outside perspective, it's probably pretty frustrating. Early on, we tracked a lot of our own data. A lot of effort of the people involved and for myself was in gathering the data and then automating the process of getting it into a database and summarizing it. And then, excuse me, right around the COVID shutdown, so around 2020, SportLogic started offering their product to the OHL. So I don't know the exact number, but definitely the majority of OHL teams, I think, use SportLogic now. And probably somewhere between 50 and 90% is my guess. At the time that SportLogic entered, we had already built an internal platform. So we take our database, consolidate it, and have this one repository for visualizations, tools, etc. And then once we had access to the SportLogic data, we did a pretty big process of converting everything to be based off those inputs. So I probably can't say too much in terms of the specific details, but getting access to so much high quality data, and I like to use the phrase like higher resolution. So just so much like a TV going from low res to HD. It's definitely transformed the impact you can have with analytics in junior. And I think talking about all this as well, I definitely want to give credit to some of my colleagues who've had a really big impact. Alex Robson, Hendrix Haynes, Matt Hitzig, Elena Hogue, and Zoe Jerome, and honestly, many others. I could probably name 10, but those 5 I think have had a really big impact. And I code myself, but they also all deserve a lot of credit. So,
without asking to give too much, I'm curious how much is as you kind of mentioned, to go through some, how much hand tracking is actually done now? Is there still much, or is it kind of have you gotten to the spot where everything's essentially animated or automated? Like where is kind of on that kind of scale of things right now?
So at the OHL level, the manual tracking component is really focused on the OHL draft. So U16 players, this year it'll be the 2008 foreign players eligible for our draft. There's all different sources you can try to pull things together, but points is what you're getting at right now. So if you want anything more than that in terms of micro stats, I think a number of teams in the OHL, from what I've heard, manually have gathered that data. And so there's still lots of effort there and still room to grow for the data providers. But at the same time, the video quality the video quality and availability are not very consistent at those levels. So it'll probably be like that for some time.
We're not talking about like live barn feeds, right? Is that kind of like live hand tracking, like live barn feeds? Is that what you're doing for 16-year-olds, for 15-year-olds?
Live Barn just acquired the streaming company that covered the GTHL. So yes, we are talking about live barn feeds.
With that, just kind of continue real quick with that age group. We've talked before on this show about the challenge of figuring out 18-year-olds for the NHL draft and who they are. You're talking about kids who are obviously even younger and various leagues and levels and everything like that. What's the challenge like when you're trying to build that board of who's actually good? Obviously, I'm sure there's some that it's pretty obvious, but when you're building the board in general for the OHL draft, what's that like?
It's definitely a challenge. I think the best example, and Mike McKenzie gave this example a few years ago, is it's like studying for an exam, that you have 8 months to prepare and then it all happens on one day. And, so you have to chip away at it and need to be as prepared as possible. But I think we try to integrate all aspects of player evaluation, so scouting, analytics, and we put a really big emphasis in Kitchener on the off ice, who they are as a person. There's a pretty wide spectrum, I think, of how teams could think about that side of it. But, we want good, hardworking kids like everyone else. But I think how much weight teams place on that is probably the biggest difference. And methods to go about getting that information. And we spend a lot of time doing background research on players as well. I think that would be something that I would emphasize.
Yeah, I love the analogies that you've laid out so far, particularly the one about going from kind of low res TV to a high resolution picture. When we had Eric Tulsky on several episodes ago, he said it was like he went from turning the light on once every 10 seconds to turning a light on 9 times every 10 seconds, and 10 times every second. So you're getting a much, much, much sharper picture. And so, with all of that, available in the OHL, I think the other thing that's kind of fascinating is the shift away from needing kind of manual tracking at the OHL level. I mean, I remember back, 7, 8 years ago where folks were getting plucked out of the public space to do manual tracking for OHL teams. And now you've sort of seen that, chip away. And now it's really needed at those lower levels. And so, what I want to get your take on, and this is going to be a tough question because you're in the OHL, you see what's in the OHL, but I got to throw it out there because I'm always curious what the perspectives are. outside of the OHL, how much attention do you pay to other junior leagues? And are there certain junior leagues that, in your estimation or your opinion, appear to be kind of rising up the ranks in terms of quality of development leagues?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. And I think in terms of how much attention do we pay, I'd say a reasonable amount. The more, not every player in North America is eligible for the OHL, but for the ones who are, so based in Ontario or born in certain parts of the United States, any player who wasn't selected in the OHL draft is a free agent. So, the extent to which we could get a above average or very strong OHL player as a free agent is, from the asset management perspective, quote unquote, I really don't like that terminology, but, it's a free player if you can get a good free agent somewhere. So that's definitely important. And we also have a lot of prospects in lower level, like junior A, junior B, junior C in Ontario. So all of that is on our radar, and we have analytics focused on that as well. But and it's funny. I think when talking to players and families about their decision, which league to go to, really they tend to focus NCAA versus CHL. And understandably, because right now the way the NCAA rules are, if you play in the CHL, you're disqualified and you can't eventually get an NCAA scholarship for hockey. But at the same time, the comparison's a little bit of apples and oranges, because not the majority of NCAA players don't play as a true freshman, like in their first year of eligibility. So one league is like NCAA is 20 to 24-year-olds, OHL is 16 to 20-year-olds. And the message we give to players is, for the top most elite players, that, and obviously being biased from the OHL, we think that they'd be best off playing against the best competition as soon as possible and trying to fast track themselves to pro and getting a pro contract. But at the same time, for players who maybe go in the later rounds of the OHL draft and who wouldn't make the OHL right away, they can sometimes benefit from the longer runway and their development. So, but I think back to your question, outside the OHL, I think it's not really a league, but the U.S. national team development program, like they definitely do an amazing job of identifying and developing top players. And I think U.S. players in the age groups we scout, it's a very exciting opportunity for them when they got invited to that. And we've had a few players in Kitchener who do 2 years, or over the years more than a few, but 2 years in the national team program and then come play for us. And I'd say there's definitely specific programs in other leagues that deserve credit and stand out for the recruiting. But I think the U.S. national team should get the most credit. It's kind of funny, as a side note, our staff were joking about this recently, that there used to be a CHL Russia series every fall. And I think there'd be 6 games with all-star teams, 1 from each league, if I'm remembering it right. But right now, those games aren't happening, like, for understandable reasons. But we were joking it'd be really cool to replace that with a USA-Canada series, where whether it's the U.S. national team versus CHL All-Stars or an all-star team from each league, that just as a fan, it'd be pretty exciting to watch and probably pretty intense.
It's funny you bring that up, because I was actually at the U.S. game this past weekend, and when they were playing Green Bay, and I brought that up to somebody over there, and they brought up the point where this person has no power making decision at all, but they were just joking. So, well, it's fitting that the national team program now plays where an OHL team used to be, in Plymouth, right there. So it's there's even a natural shared footprint right there, venue wise, that would work for that. So you're not we're definitely on board with that idea. You kind of I was going to ask you about recruiting, but you kind of touched on that. I'm curious, as far as when it comes to building an OHL roster, there's two things that were interesting to me. One is there's players where I'm sure you're taking flyers on, right? Because we'll occasionally see even the U.S. national team guy go for his 19-year-old season will go to the OHL maybe. We'll occasionally see that. Or we'll see the player who, we'll see a player who has an opportunity to go, who might be choosing between one or the other. So I'm curious as far as when it comes to kind of evaluating the risks and drafting rights for guys before you get into the recruiting, how do you guys kind of assess that internally is this guy an OHL player? And I'm sure that even could connect to, I know I'm casting a wide net here, but to the import draft as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's one of the biggest areas that, I guess my background in finance, where everything's like risk reward decisions, and you're always thinking of pairing those two things together. I have found very applicable to thinking through those types of judgments and trade-offs. But and yeah, it definitely applies to the import draft as well. But for within the OHL draft, I think players definitely fall into two categories. Like 100% will come to the league, and then there's a ranking of those players, and then somewhere between 0 and 100%, or somewhere less than 100, but above 0, that they would come to the league. And you definitely have to think of them differently. And if you go through past OHL drafts of the history, you'll see, elite players who have, the U.S. national program selection process happens before the OHL draft. So elite players who've committed to that team, you'll see where they get picked in the OHL draft. Also, can't say enough on the recruiting side that all that work really needs to happen before the draft from the standpoint of the team, right? In terms of contacting people, building relationships, and trying to see, trying to meet them and assess each player's, like, we interview every player who's high on our list to a certain point, but trying to get a good assessment of that information and then make our list accordingly.
So let's fast forward a little bit from the import drafts and the OHL draft and talk about, after a player's been drafted by an NHL team, kind of what level of involvement do those NHL teams kind of have on directing, player development in the OHL and at that level? I mean, I know with you guys this year in Kitchener, you've got a handful of folks that have been, drafted. And so kind of walk us through a little bit of what that involvement and that relationship is like with those NHL teams.
So the majority of the communication with the NHL team will run through our GM, Mike McKenzie, and the rest of our coaches at different times to an extent. But the way most NHL teams manage it is that they have, most often, I think it's a director of player development, but there's different titles and a different number of people for each organization that gets involved. And so if it's a director of player development, that's a person who will travel around to all the different prospects in different leagues, watch them play a few games, meet with them, maybe go for lunch, and then sometimes they'll watch video with them or even go on the ice with them together and work on certain skills. But every pro team's a little bit different and invest more or less resources or staff members, I guess, as an investment in this area. But I found almost all the teams we've worked with, they find a pretty good balance of wanting to integrate their message about what they think the prospect needs to work on with what the coaches are thinking and communicating with that player. Because, one, we're all watching the same games. And, on the junior side, we are trying to, everyone in junior knows it's our job to try to prepare players to be ready for the next level when they get there. But I also think it's the highest impact when everyone's saying the same thing. And, at some level becomes up to the player to work on those things and try to improve.
I've got one more as a follow-up going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. You mentioned you played rugby, and I'm curious, we've actually had Australian rules football mentioned on this podcast before as well. And so I'm curious, just real quick, in your experience with rugby, if there's anything you took from that sport to hockey or anything like that, because that's it's something that I wrote a note down 30 minutes ago when you brought up that as part of your history. So I'm going to close out with that one to move us outside of hockey for a second.
Sure. I think so. The biggest thing for me personally is just the experience of like going through what an athlete goes through. I definitely learned a lot from that, and I think when interacting with players or coaches, it helps a lot with communication and just understanding there. I definitely don't think someone has to have been a hockey player or an athlete to do these roles. I think everyone in analytics is a little more biased that way as well. But no, for rugby specifically, one of our assistant coaches, Brad Flynn, has played rugby as well. So we've talked about this, and one of the biggest similarities is kind of the angles players take when attacking. And in rugby, you're defending a line at a time, and I think Bill Belichick has a quote where he compares games where you're defending a line like rugby or football to defending a point like hockey or basketball or soccer. But in hockey, there's also the blue line and the red line, right? So there's definitely moments there where how players see and use space and as when they're attacking and defending that are quite similar. And Brad's point, which I definitely agree with, is just kind of the contact or the fear element, where at any point, if you're not kind of ready to go, you could really hurt yourself. So there's definitely similarities there between the sports. It's also the Rugby World Cup right now. If you guys are or are not following it.
I know. I was going to say that's what I was about to plug is, we've got Rugby World Cup going on. I can't say that I know much, if at all, about the sport. I've been to one game over in Sydney, and that was a lot of fun. But other than that, I haven't seen a ton. But yeah, definitely watch if you're a big rugby fan, and if not, there's always time to get into the sport, which I think is one of the most fun to watch live, I will say. But Mike, I just want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate all of your insights, and best of luck on the season.
Thanks very much. I appreciate you guys having me.
All right, folks, that's Mike Zsolt of the Kitchener Rangers joining us today. Again, very much appreciate him taking the time to hop on, and look forward to seeing what Kitchener has to offer this season. All right, folks, that was Mike Zsolt. Again, can't thank him enough for taking the time to join us today ahead of the Kitchener Rangers, and best of luck to the Rangers this season. So let's wrap things up here with a pet peeve, I guess, of ours, as we were talking about before the show got kicked off, the preseason scheduling of NHL games. I saw this tweet the other day. I'm not going to call it a post. It's still a tweet. But I saw this tweet the other day. I think it was from Mark Lazarus, who covers Chicago for The Athletic, basically saying, I don't know how the NFL, the NFL and NBA folks do this. I am already so bored of the preseason. Like, can we just fast forward and get to the regular season? And then when you look at sort of the imbalance of games scheduled for each of these teams, let's just go. Let's just keep going.
It's my beef with the NHL preseason schedule is it's that NFL NBA comp is a good one. I don't know how they do that many. It's the fact is, not only do we have so many games, we have like this acceptance that it's not a real sporting event. And I know the win-loss doesn't mean anything, and that's fine. I don't care about the games meaning something win-loss, but when you have so many games we get scenarios where basically the general feel, and I used this as a comparison for a freelance story the other day for a magazine down in Dallas, where preseason games are basically professional wrestling. What they are is they are set up to set to add a couple more tickets to your season ticket package price. Like when they raise your season ticket price for a little bit, and they put it up a little bit. Like, oh, but you actually get instead of 41 home games, you get 45 home games. Like, no, you don't. You get 4 scrimmages. Like it's that, and it's because star players, veteran players don't want to travel. Preseason travel is ridiculous. Like Detroit right now. Yesterday, now Chicago's not a bad flight, but they were on the ice in Detroit till 12:30 yesterday. Took a flight, I think it was like 2:30 to Chicago. You're traveling the day of the game. It's not conducive to A, player health, B, actual good hockey, and C, like a fair competition. You get one team sitting at home, and so teams naturally play their best players, their veterans, at home, and road teams, you just kind of send the AHL squad with enough guys to fill the veteran limit. And that's something we should mention real quick. There is a veteran limit for NHL preseason games. I believe it's 8, but it might be 7. I gotta double check that. But it's basically you have to have enough players that by the CBA rules make it look like you're fielding a roster. Now, there's a lot of ways around that. Like, it's why you see, like, Nate Danielson, who played last night in Chicago, counts as a veteran because he's a recent first-round pick. Recent first-round picks count as veterans. I think it's to reach that veteran status, you only have to have played 50 NHL games the year prior or something like that. So the 6th and 7th, the 7th defenseman that was in and out of the lineup counts as a veteran that's worthy of your ticket price. And I don't mean that as a slight against the 7th defenseman. I mean it more as a slight against this system. And we all know, and coaches, as they build these preseason lineups and everything, we always hear, oh, well, the last game or the last 2 games will be our dress rehearsal. So my proposed solution on this is, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, is we should just do, and you can have the exception for like the neutral site game, like in Australia, you want to grow the game, fine, whatever. Nothing against that. But what you should be doing is like, okay, every team plays 4 preseason games, 2 home, 2 away. You still get to, you tack on like, oh, it's 43 season tickets and it's 43 games in your season ticket price. But with 4 games, all of a sudden, and Derek Lalonde the other day said he likes his top players to play 4 to 5 preseason games. Okay, there's 4 preseason games. I'm going to get 4 preseason games of, in Detroit's case, I'm going to get 4 preseason games of Dylan Larkin or 3 games of Dylan Larkin. I don't have to worry about looking at the lineup and thinking, I don't know if I'm going to go to the game tonight. Like the Chicago game on Sunday, this is the perfect example of the flaw in preseason. And I'm a media guy. Let's be clear on this. Like, I was looking at that. I was waiting for the Chicago lineup to come out Sunday to make the real hard decision of whether I was going to watch that hockey game. Derek Lalonde's kids made the same decision. They were like, the Lalonde family wasn't coming to the game until they realized Connor Bedard was in the lineup. Like, that should not be my base level for whether I'm going to a sporting event. I should be like, oh, I'm going to go see a hockey game. It's the preseason is basically a sham. There needs to be less of it, and that would make it better.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's a sham for a slightly different reason in that there's not really a legitimate opportunity for these guys to play their way onto NHL rosters. You think about the way the cap is structured, you think about, the limits of the active roster, you think about the number of standard player contracts a team can have over the course of the season, and then on top of that, you roll into the CHL-NHL agreement, you roll into that IHF rules about, being able to transfer depending on where your contracts are and the other professional leagues in the sport. There are very few players that can play their way onto an NHL roster based on their performance in a preseason, just because of the format and the structure. And I think that kind of stinks because that is a little bit of what's advertised in the preseason. It's like, oh, let's, get a chance to see these top prospects. You get a chance to see these guys do it. We see it in the NFL and the NBA. Guys play their way onto rosters because of the flexibility that's available there. NFL obviously having a much larger roster. but we don't really see that as much in hockey. Like, we're getting to watch Nate Danielson. You wrote a terrific article on Nate Danielson, why he's been so impressive. At the same time, 100% Nate Danielson is not going to be on the Detroit Red Wings come opening night. And that's because of the structure of the system here. We know the CHL, NHL rules. We know the Wings, with their salary cap, probably can't make this work with the amount of contracts they've got signed. He's going back to Brandon. He's going to play in the WHL. But he was arguably one of their top 3 forwards in the preseason thus far. And so that's the other reason why I'm just like, let's just shorten this thing. Let's just get to the regular season. We get a few exhibitions for these guys. Fans can see them pull on the Red Wing sweater, pull on whatever jersey sweater they want. But at the end of the day, it's not really doing anything other than just being an exhibition. So let's just shorten them.
Yeah, the other thing to me that it's just it's still it's too much of an old school thinking. And I think that's something that people come into training camp. Like, players, and I wrote last week about Jake Wallman's off-season training with Matt Nickel up in Toronto. And he trains, like, they get a group of 25 NHL players up in Toronto with Tom Wilson, Tyler Seguin, McDavid joins them for a bit, Jake Wallman. They're doing NHL-style training camp back to July. Like, it's something where I think it's still a little bit of this old-school mentality of, oh, we got to get guys into shape. Like, yes, in the 90s, guys showed up hungover and out of shape. They had to, like, you had to kick their ass to get them into shape. And that's what it was. And that's not the case with today's NHL athlete. So you don't need these games to get them into shape. And it almost creates a falsehood of the PTO too. And it's actually really annoying to me because, like, we sign these guys and it's sold as, well, we brought this guy in on a PTO, and really what they are is their bodies to take damage so actual NHL players don't get damaged in preseason. They're professional athletes. They are still at the spot where they're considered enough to be close enough to professional athletes and be in these options to get PTOs. And I get but teams aren't, like, other than Alex Chazon, how many players have really turned a PTO into NHL jobs? It hardly ever happens. Like, I thought Michael Hutchinson had an incredibly honest and great talk about this yesterday after Red Wings practice yesterday before he played the second half of the game. Michael Hutchinson knows full well that he has no future in Detroit. Like, he was asked about, and he gave the kind answer where people were like, oh, do you think this can get you a job in Detroit? He knows full well that Ville Husso's the starter, James Reimer and Alex Lyon are the backup, and if he's going to get a job in the Red Wings organization, it's going to be on an AHL deal to support Sebastian Cossa. He knows that. He knows the reality of it. He knows the reality of the PTO, but he's like, okay, I'll come to camp and stay in shape and everything like that. Refreshingly honest conversation about what a PTO really is with Michael Hutchinson yesterday, because it's him staying in shape and being a goalie. Obviously, goalies are a little bit different. Him basically waiting for another Vasilevsky type injury for another team to be like, okay, we need to open up a spot for an NHL contract. But all these other guys, like, I mean, I think they were, like, of all the PTO players, and I've watched more preseason games than I should just because I'm trying to get ready for the season and stuff, but, like, you listen to it, it's like, other than maybe Noah Gregor in Toronto, I've yet to hear a conversation where a PTO guy is actually like, oh, he could actually be on this roster, right? Like, and I don't even know if I don't know if that's just the Toronto media cycle pushing Gregor's chances up higher as well. Like, so you get these guys who, like, to go back to the team I used to cover, Dallas, like, Jordy Benn's on a PTO with Dallas right now. Does anyone really think Jordy Benn is going to, that team has 8 NHL defensemen, has a top prospect in Liam Bixel. Does anyone really think Jordy Benn is there for anything other than as an extra body so that these other guys don't have to take the wear and tear of preseason? Like, I think it's kind of it's a falsehood of what we sell to people. Well, not you and I, but it's a falsehood of what teams sell of PTOs of, oh, there's always an opportunity. And it's not fair. Like, I don't, we found a soapbox here that I didn't realize I was about to go so deep on, but there we go.
Folks, that's what you can come to expect on Expected by Whom. We'll always find a soapbox to get on and stand and parrot some thoughts, whether you agree with them or not. And so that'll wrap things up for us here today. Appreciate everybody tuning in. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please direct those to the direct messages of Ryan Hanna on Twitter. All right, folks, that does it for us today. Appreciate everybody tuning in.